We begin with the story of a man who once proudly disproved a suspected haunting. At the time, his cynical response to those who upheld it to be real might make one think that he had no belief in the paranormal at all. But the reality was that some years earlier, according to him, he was confronted with the clear vision of an apparition. A very different experience indeed, and one he not only could not disprove, he had no interest in trying to do so. The man in question is Frank Brooks Smith, the author of the book I Remember the Tall Ships, and a seafaring New Zealander who, before his death in 1991, was one of the last surviving sailors of the pre-steamboat era. In the early 1920s, Brooks Smith was on a tanker named Orawati, which was on a voyage across the Pacific Ocean from New Zealand to San Francisco. During that voyage, one of the shipmates committed suicide, an incident that unsurprisingly affected the other sailors deeply. The more superstitious of the men swore that the dead man was now haunting the ship, several of them claiming to have heard his hoarse whispers as they approached the bow, although no one had seen the alleged phantom. Not wanting to fall prey to what he called superstitious fears, Frank Brooks Smith investigated the so-called haunted area of the ship one morning at 4 o'clock. He recalled some years later how the ship was rolling moderately as he walked along the deck, before he too heard the rasping whispers of what could only be described as human. He moved to the bow and climbed the forecastle, where the sounds which had now become louder were coming from the space below. After checking the space beneath the forecastle, the whispers now came from behind him. He moved to the rail, put his hand on the anchor chain, and that's when he felt it. The source of the phantom-like sounds were merely the rusted anchor chains moving against one another as the ship rolled from side to side. He secured the moving chains with a rope and returned to his shipmates later that morning exclaiming, with a wry smile, that he had, quote, found the ghost and bound him hands and feet. The quote-unquote haunting, in this case, was simply the result of feelings of sadness at the loss of a friend, mixed with superstition and fear. Although on this occasion Brooks Smith revealed the true source of what was believed to be a haunting, there was another incident that befell him some years earlier. An incident that, up until his death, he upheld as irrefutable proof that ghosts exist. In the years before Brooks Smith went to sea during World War I, he lived in Christchurch, New Zealand and worked in a bank. One of the perks of being an employee was that he was given free accommodation in an apartment above the bank. But with the free board came responsibility. He would be expected to confront anyone who attempted to rob the bank during the night. To assist him in this role, he was issued with a .45 caliber Webley revolver and several boxes of ammunition. He slept with the loaded weapon by his bedside every night. One night he was awoken by a sudden noise. As he sat up, his eyes were drawn to the white-gowned figure of a woman who looked as if she was knelt in prayer beside his bed. His reaction to the extraordinary vision was surprisingly rational though. His first thought was that she may have been a decoy or distraction left by burglars who planned to break into the bank below. With a clear presence of mind, he reached for his revolver and took aim at the woman. As he did, she faded away. He got out of bed and searched his living space, still believing that some outlandish trick was being played by potential burglars. After finding nothing, he returned to bed. This is the story Frank Brooks Smith told to his family, although it isn't known if he ever saw the apparition again, or if he made any efforts to find out who she was. Frank Brooks Smith, who passed away in 1991, was so affected by his experience that he recounted it in his 1980 book, I Remember the Tall Ships. It's quite common in cases of hauntings for the people who tell their tales to remain anonymous and to omit pieces of information such as dates and names. For believers of the paranormal, this would presumably be to stop would-be ghost hunters, tourists or the curious from tracking them down. Understandable, but this lack of basic information when researching a story can sometimes be frustrating, especially when you are trying to establish a firm time period. This next story is such a case, but it's an intriguing one nonetheless, and one I've not heard before, so I've decided to include it here. We now come to the Montrose neighborhood of Houston, Texas. Branard Street to be exact. There was once an elderly man named Mr. Cohen who lived in a small house on the street. He was often seen mowing the lawn and was known for keeping the house and grounds immaculate. The kindly yet naive gentleman befriended a young man who was often seen visiting the house. One night the two of them had a heated argument, and the young man took a knife to his trusting host. The assailant left the lifeless Mr. Cohen in a pool of blood on the kitchen floor. I don't know the fate of the murderous young man, but for months after the body of Mr. Cohen was removed, the house remained vacant, and the garden he had worked so hard to maintain became an overgrown eyesore. The house was eventually put on the market and soon found a buyer. The buyer, who wished to keep his true identity a secret when relaying his story, was told about the violent death of the previous owner. Nonetheless, he liked the house so much that he agreed to seal the deal anyway. In 1985, when he told his story to the Houston City magazine, he said that he personally felt nothing unusual about the place at first. His friends, on the other hand, who would visit from time to time, complained of cold spots in the house, and his dog would snarl and howl whenever it entered the kitchen. As time went on, things escalated, and the owner began to notice the effects of what was now thought to be a genuine haunting. Items would inexplicably be moved around the house, and the cold spots became more pronounced. The haunting eventually came to a head when a friend visited from England. The man slept in the living room and one night was awoken by what he described as a blowing in his ear. As he raised his head from the pillow, he saw the figure of a man pacing at the foot of the bed. When he woke his host and explained what he had seen, the house owner wasn't at all surprised, because he too had felt the presence of the apparition during the night. Unlike his friend though, he was not at all shaken by the presence. He said he felt no feelings of malice towards himself or his guest, and believes that the ghost of Mr. Cohen was simply watching over the house he once loved, a house that the new owner promised he would take equally good care of. As well as the 1985 edition of Houston City magazine, the story of the Branard Street haunting was featured in Docia Schultz Williams' 1995 book Ghosts Along the Texas Coast. It was late September 1896 when a Mr. Thomas Lucas Smith wrote to London's Daily Telegraph from his home on Mansion House Street in central London. In his letter received on the 2nd of October, he describes an experience he had a few days earlier at a friend's home in Brighton on England's southeast coast. It was getting late, and the family Thomas Lucas Smith was staying with had gone to bed. Now on his own, he took a book from a shelf and read until the midnight hour. Shortly after 12, he retired to bed himself. He claims that as he made his way up the moonlit stairs, he saw, on the landing, the gradual formation of an apparition. The translucent feminine figure, which he said appeared to have formed from the moonlight itself, was tall, well-formed, and clothed in a plain garment which resembled a corpse's shroud. He watched as the figure appeared to glance out of the window at the moonlit grounds outside, before letting out a loud sigh, which Smith said shook his nerves more than the sight of the phantom itself. Her form then grew indistinct, and soon vanished completely. When Thomas Lucas Smith told his hosts of his experience the next day, they became very upset by his description of the lady, and showed Smith a portrait of a late family member. The portrait, which we are told was 70 years old, showed, according to Smith, an uncanny resemblance to the woman he had seen in the moonlight. He refused to publicly name the family or the address at which he had the experience, yet goes on to say that he awaits an explanation for what he experienced from, quote, those scientists and conjurers who laugh at spiritualism. He added, I know my experience was real. Back in the 1970s, tabloid newspaper The Sun made a request to its readers to relay any paranormal experiences they may have had. One of the, I'm assuming many people who replied, was Mrs. Barbara Manning of Birkenhead, Merseyside. The story she told was so intriguing that it attracted the attention of paranormal author Jack Hallam, who asked Mrs. Manning to go into a little more detail about her claimed encounters. She explained to him that she had once lived in the top portion of a now demolished rented property near Rock Ferry. During her time there, she acquired an old wardrobe from a recently deceased friend of her mother-in-law. One night after the wardrobe was placed in the master bedroom, Barbara Manning awoke at around 1 a.m. to see a white-haired lady standing next to the piece of furniture. The lady then turned and moved towards the wardrobe door, opened it and peered inside. Barbara said that she sat completely still for what she described as quite a time, watching as the woman appeared to be looking for something, and then, all of a sudden, she was no longer there. On another occasion, Barbara was descending the stairs which led up to her flat. As she did, she momentarily turned, looked back up the staircase, and saw the same white-haired lady looking at her over the banister. One might think that fear would have taken hold, but Barbara said that she felt no fear and slowly made her way back up the stairs, presumably to confront the mysterious woman. As she neared the top, the woman again disappeared. The white-haired lady, who Barbara Manning described as solid but somewhat hazy, never did appear at her Rock Ferry flat again. She must have found what she was looking for, Barbara said. According to paranormal author Jack Hallam, there is, or was, a logbook kept at the Aldgate Underground Station in East London. Within the pages of that book were records of the various paranormal encounters reported at that part of the Underground Railway. In one section of the tunnel here, a much older train track crosses the present-day one. Close to this small intersection of track is a door which was once the entrance to the station's control room. On a few occasions during the mid to late 20th century, the sounds of footsteps have been heard along the track, accompanied by sounds of whistling. It's unknown if the sounds emanate from the same source, and some have said that the whistling is nothing more than a passing train on a parallel track. But both sounds would always suddenly stop simultaneously at the point of the disused control room. It's said that during the 1960s, an engineer in the control room looked out onto the track and witnessed what he believed to be a phantom figure. He said that the ghostly woman moved slowly along the track towards his colleague who was working with high voltage equipment. He watched as she then reached out and appeared to stroke the top of his head before fading away. A few moments later, the same workman fell and made contact with a live rail. Suffering what would have been more than 20,000 volts through his body, he was thrown to the tunnel wall and knocked unconscious. Miraculously, coming away with no more than minor bruising, he made a full recovery and later learned of what his colleague had witnessed. A variation of the story says that the spectre didn't materialise until after the accident had happened, approaching and stroking the man's head as if to comfort him as he lay unconscious. Had the apparition of a dead relative, an old station worker or passenger come to warn or comfort the 1960s rail worker? According to some authors of the supernatural, the Aldgate Station logbook, which apparently cannot be found today, said that no identity was offered for the spectral woman, although it was later suggested that it may have been the spiritual remnants of a lady who had died after falling onto a live rail during the Second World War. Another ghostly candidate for the woman's identity is a victim of the Great Plague, unearthed from the famous London plague pits to make way for the London Underground network. 18th century journalist Daniel Defoe mentions a plague pit once situated on or close to the location of present-day Aldgate Station in his 1722 book, A Journal of the Plague Year. The book is a detailed account of the events of 1665 as seen through the eyes of one man. Some say it is a work of pure fiction, while others say that it's likely Defoe based the work on the actual journals of his late uncle Henry Foe, who lived in Whitechapel, half a mile east of where Aldgate Station now stands. Built in 1924 with its grand opening in 1926, La Concha Hotel in Florida's Key West with its 7 stories, 160 rooms, marble floors and 1920s decor, is the tallest building in the city. The hotel, known today as Crowne Plaza Key West La Concha, was once one of the most glamorous and celebrated in the state, and was host to all kinds of famous people, from presidents, royalty, pop stars, gangsters and famous authors, most notably Ernest Hemingway. In 1930 the hotel changed ownership and was renamed Key West Colonial. It continued normal operation for the next 10 years, but slowly the place fell into disrepair over the next few decades. By 1982 only the rooftop bar was open to the public. Much of the lower levels by now had been boarded up. That is until architect Richard Rowell began a gradual multi-million-dollar restoration in the early to mid-1980s. It was New Year's Eve 1983. A young waiter native to Key West had just collected some dishes from the 5th floor and was on his way to the kitchen on the lower levels. It was 1:45 a.m. and he was minutes away from finishing his shift when he backed the dish-stacked trolley up to the elevator doors. Turning around momentarily, he pushed the button and waited. As he heard the door open behind him, he proceeded to pull the trolley back into the empty elevator shaft. The waiter and his trolley fell 5 floors. For some reason, the elevator had malfunctioned and stopped at the 6th floor, not the 5th. The young man's body, the upper part crushed by the trolley that had followed him down, was found by a maintenance man an hour later, when a hotel resident reported that the elevator was not responding. Naturally, over time the horrific and sad incident was eventually forgotten. The elevator was fixed and business continued at La Concha. But the 5th floor had undergone a change since that New Year's night in '83. Hotel staff and guests began to report seeing someone moving around in the shadows of the unlit areas of the 5th floor at night. Some staff said they'd been brushed upon or tapped on the shoulder whilst going about their duties, and up until the early 21st century, some of the maids refused to work on the 5th floor because, allegedly, their carts would move from where they had left them, often being found close to the elevator doors. Other incidents not thought to be linked to the unfortunate waiter have been reported from one suite in particular. Back in the 1930s, it was frequented by Ernest Hemingway. According to some, it was a place where he'd entertain his mistress, Martha Gellhorn, who would later become his wife. One male guest staying in the Hemingway suite complained that a man had been into his room the night before. Not only that, he had knocked the video recorder off the table during the night. When the guest was startled during the night by the loud noise, he said he looked up to see the silhouette of a man hunched over in the corner against the streetlights. When he turned the lights on, no one was there, and the door was firmly locked. The event was a complete mystery. And then there's a haunting tale of the dishonest lawyer, another relatively modern story as hauntings go from the late 1980s. This man was being investigated for fraudulent activities, and if brought before the court of law and found guilty, it would have been the end of his career. The least he could do, he thought, was to ensure that his family received a good payout in the event of his death. In order for his family to receive his life insurance payment, he would of course need to make his suicide look like an accident, so he took a handheld tape recorder and concocted a story that would, in theory, clear his name and lay the blame with a corrupt secretary. Taking to the rooftop of La Concha, he ranted into the tape recorder that hitmen were hot on his trail. His time was running out, he said, and pleaded for someone to look after his family when he was gone. He then jumped from the hotel's rooftop balcony, presumably in the hope that people would think he was pushed or thrown. Alas, his plan failed, although unlike himself, the tape recorder survived. The recording was listened to, but there was already enough evidence against him to prove his guilt according to federal agents, and his family never did receive a payout. Since his death, people have reported seeing a visibly distressed man pacing La Concha's rooftop balcony. Others have even reported seeing a man fall. However, no distressed man or body was ever found when these reports were investigated.